My son and his wife locked my husband and me in the basement of our own home, shouting, "This is ours now." Sitting in the dampness, I heard my husband whisper, "Hush, they don't know what lies behind that wall." When they left, my husband moved a loose brick and showed me a secret he had kept for 39 years. Hello, dear listeners. Thank you for joining me today. Before I begin my story, I would be very happy if you subscribed to the channel and left a comment writing which state or country you are listening from. It always warms my heart to see how far our stories travel. Enjoy listening. This house knows how to breathe. I know the rhythm of its breath as well as my own. In the morning, when the first rays of the Georgia sun break through the old pecan trees in the garden, it takes a quiet, deep inhale, and dust motes dance in pillars of golden light. In the evening, it exhales, cooling down, and the old beams creak, as if sighing, settling in for the night. I have lived here for 40 years. I have grown into these walls, or perhaps they have grown into me. My father-in-law, Cornelius's father, a man with a steady gaze and a wide soul, built this house. He built it not as a vacation home, but as a legacy, a place where his grandchildren and great-grandchildren would laugh, a place of strength. This morning I was making soup as usual, simple chicken broth with dumplings, the way my grandmother taught me. Cornelius eats almost nothing lately, but the aroma of chicken broth is so familiar, so like home, that it sometimes sparks a flicker of interest in him. I was cutting carrots into tiny, almost jewel-like cubes and remembering how I taught Travante, our son, to do this. He was little, standing on a stool next to me, his chubby fingers clutching a safety knife. "Mama, I'm a chef," he would shout, and we would both laugh. That laughter still lives in the grain of the kitchen table. "That tasteless slop again, Miss Idella?" The voice of Kessia, Travante's wife, burst into my memories like a draft in a warm room. "We talked about this yesterday. The internet has a million recipes. Broccoli cream soup, gazpacho. Can't you master something new? It's for Travante. He needs proper nutrition." She stood leaning against the doorframe in her ecru silk robe, arms crossed over her chest. She never called me Mom, only Ms. Idella, with a cold politeness that was worse than outright rudeness. I didn't turn around. I just kept stirring the broth. "Your husband loves this soup," I answered quietly. "And his father loves it. Father doesn't understand anything anymore," she cut in. "But Travante deserves better. They have been living with us for 3 years, ever since Cornelius had his first stroke. At first, it seemed right. Family should be together, especially in hard times. I gave them the entire second floor, the master suite with the balcony overlooking the garden. Cornelius and I moved downstairs to his former study so he wouldn't have to climb the stairs. Gradually, their things, their habits, their smells, Kessia's sharp perfume, Travante's tart cologne, began to displace the air of this house. Last week, she moved grandfather's armchair without asking, the one with the worn armrests where my father-in-law used to read the Savannah Tribune. She shoved it into the darkest corner and hoisted some soulless white contraption of metal and leather into its place. "It doesn't fit the modern interior," she threw over her shoulder at me. I said nothing then. I just went downstairs at night when everyone was asleep and stroked the old cracked leather of the chair the way one pets a faithful old dog. I remember how Travante used to fall asleep in it in his grandfather's arms, how I sat in it myself while pregnant, reading history books, dreaming of returning to my work at the archives when my son grew up a bit. But he kept growing. And then came Cornelius with his career, demanding constant attention, and my dream quietly gathered dust like old tomes in the attic. Cornelius lay in the study, staring at the ceiling. His body had weakened, but his mind sometimes flared with its former clarity, like an ember in a dying fire. I walked over, sat down next to him, and took his hand. His skin was dry and thin, like parchment. "How are you, my love?" I whispered. He slowly turned his head, his eyes focused on me. "They are noisy," he exhaled. Yes, they were always noisy. Their voices, their arguments about money, their loud laughter, All of it was alien to the quiet, grounded life of our home. Travante came down for lunch. He didn't say hello, sat at the table, and immediately stared at his phone. I placed a bowl of soup in front of him. He pushed it away. "Ma, we need to talk. Seriously." Kessia instantly materialized next to him, sitting opposite, folding her hands on the table. In her eyes was that predatory glint I had learned to recognize. It meant they were plotting something. "We've been thinking, with the inheritance and all these complications, bureaucracy," Travante began, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Father is in such a state. To avoid problems later, you should sign the house over to me now. A deed of gift. It's just a formality to simplify everything." My chest went cold, not from the words themselves, but from the casualness with which they were spoken, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "No," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "This house belongs to your father and me. As long as we are alive, everything stays as it is." "So you don't want to simplify things?" Kessia leaned forward. "You want your only son to run around government offices later, gathering certificates when, well, you understand." "I understand everything," I replied, looking her straight in the eyes. "And that is exactly why the answer is no." Travante finally raised his head. There was no filial love in his gaze, only cold, angry irritation, as if I were not his mother, but an annoying obstacle in his path. "I don't understand what the problem is. We live here. We take care of Father." "You live in my house," I corrected him. "I take care of Father." At that moment, Cornelius appeared in the doorway of the living room. He stood leaning against the jamb, breathing heavily. He must have heard everything. His gaze was surprisingly clear. He looked not at me, but at Travante. "You." His voice was weak, but every word rang in the ensuing silence. "You are a disgrace to our name. A disgrace." That word struck Travante like the crack of a whip. I saw his face contort. It wasn't just anger. It was the rage of a man touched in his sorest spot, his vanity, his right to bear the Dubois name, of which he was so proud. His whole life was built on that name. "What?" he screamed, jumping up so fast the chair fell with a crash. "A disgrace? Are you out of your mind? I am the only one continuing this name. This house, it is mine by right. It should have always been mine." He stepped toward his father. I jumped up, standing between them. "Travante, stop! No, enough! I am tired of this." His eyes were wild. "This is ours now." He grabbed me by the shoulder, not painfully, but with authority, and shoved me aside. Then he grabbed his father under the arm. Cornelius was as weak as a rag doll. Travante dragged us through the hallway to the heavy oak door leading to the basement. "Travante, what are you doing?" I screamed, resisting. "You'll have time to think about your behavior," he growled. He threw the door open, and the smell of dampness and cold earth hit our faces. He roughly shoved us inside onto the top step of the steep staircase. I barely held on to Cornelius to keep us from rolling down. The door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. The heavy bolt clicked from the outside. We were left in complete silence. Only my ragged breathing and the weak, raspy breathing of my husband beside me. I sank onto the cold stone step, clutching Cornelius to me. The tears wouldn't come. Inside, everything had gone numb. Years of service, years of love. My whole life given to this boy, this house, this family. All of it ended here, in this dark, damp basement. I was broken, shattered into pieces. And in this deafening silence, in this absolute darkness of despair, I heard my husband's quiet, tense whisper. He pressed his lips right to my ear, his words barely audible. "Hush, they don't know what lies behind that wall." My husband's words pierced the gloom, and I froze, listening. Above our heads, Travante's heavy, quick footsteps rang out, followed by Kessia's lighter, pattering tread. The front door slammed so hard, a dull echo rolled through the basement. A moment of silence, and then came the sound of an engine starting, quickly moving away and fading. They were gone. We were left alone in the cold, ringing silence of our own home, locked in its stone belly. "Help me," Cornelius rasped. His voice was weak, but there was a steely persistence in it I didn't recognize. I helped him up. His body was trembling from weakness and cold. Slowly, step by step, we descended the chipped stairs to the dirt floor. It smelled of the stale vegetables we used to store, damp clay and oblivion. The only source of light was a thin strip breaking through from under the door upstairs. In this dim twilight, I could barely make out the shapes of old shelves covered in cobwebs and empty jars piled in the corner. Cornelius led me not to the shelves, but to the far wall, to the very masonry of the foundation. He leaned against the rough, damp stones, breathing heavily. "Here," he whispered. "Father showed me when I was 18, said it was for the most extreme case. I thought it would never come." He ran his shoulder along the wall, searching for something by touch in the gloom. Finally, he stopped. "Here, press." "I don't have the strength." I touched the stone where he pointed. One of the rough granite blocks seemed no different from the others. But when I pressed harder, it gave way, sliding inward with a quiet scraping sound. Behind it, a black square void opened up. Inside this niche, something dark lay hidden. I reached my fingers in and felt cold, smooth metal. It was a small tin box, an old tobacco tin, the kind popular in my childhood. I pulled it out. It was light, almost weightless. We returned to the steps and sat side by side. Cornelius took the box from me. His fingers struggled with the simple latch for a long time. Finally, with a quiet click, the lid opened. I expected to see anything. Old photographs, maybe a few gold coins hidden by my father-in-law for a rainy day. But inside there was nothing shiny, only a few yellowed papers folded in four. Cornelius took out the top document and unfolded it. Even in this faint light, I saw the official seal and faded violet ink. It was a birth certificate. "Read it," Cornelius said. I took the paper. It was fragile as an autumn leaf. The name written in calligraphy was unfamiliar to me. Cassius Thorne, place of birth. A prison hospital in Mississippi. A place I had only heard terrible stories about. Mother's name, dashed out. Father's name, Orion Thorne. "I don't understand," I whispered, looking at my husband. "That's me," he said quietly. "That is my real name." Something snapped inside me. For 40 years, I had lived with Cornelius Dubois, son of the esteemed Dr. Dubois, heir to a famous family, and now this fragile sheet of paper was telling me I didn't know the man I had shared a bed with, raised a son with, built a life with. He took out the next document. An adoption decree. Cassius Thorne adopted by citizen Dubois, Langston James. The new son is assigned the surname Dubois and the name Cornelius. Everything was certified with dry official stamps. The last item in the box wasn't an official paper, but a letter written in the familiar, confident handwriting of my father-in-law. Cornelius handed it to me. "Son," I read mentally, struggling to make out the words in the dark. "If you are reading this, it means dark times have come, and I am likely gone. I never told you the whole truth, fearing it would break your life. Your father, Orion Thorne, was a brilliant scientist, an honest and brave man. But in our country, honesty and courage often become a crime. He was slandered, labeled a threat to national security, a traitor, and he perished in prison. I was his friend and colleague. I promised him I wouldn't let his son be lost. I adopted you, gave you my name, my family, to protect you, to erase the brand of a traitor's son. Live with dignity, Cornelius. Wear the Dubois name with honor. But never forget whose blood flows in your veins. The blood of a brave man." I read to the end and slowly folded the letter. The cold that had started in the basement was now coming from within. It chilled me to the bone. All these years Cornelius lived with this secret. He feared the shadow of the past. He protected a name that wasn't his by birthright. And Travante, our son, he built his whole life, his entire pride, on this name. He boasted of his grandfather the doctor, his pedigree, his heritage, a heritage that didn't exist by blood. All the pain, all the humiliation of the last few years, all the insults I had swallowed like bitter medicine, all of it suddenly compressed into a single point in my chest. But it didn't explode in a scream or tears. It froze, turning into an icy, perfectly clear crystal. And in its cold facets, I saw everything with dazzling clarity. I was an archivist. I worked with documents, with facts, with histories people tried to forget or rewrite. I knew the value of truth locked in yellowed paper. And what I held now wasn't just a family secret. It was a weapon. It was power, absolute, undeniable power. We sat in the dark for 2, maybe 3 hours. Time lost its flow. Cornelius dozed off, leaning his head on my shoulder, exhausted by the tension. I sat motionless, staring into the darkness, and my mind, for the first time in years, worked precisely and silently, like a well-oiled machine. A plan formed itself, logical and cold. Finally, noise was heard upstairs. The bolt was slid back with a sharp scrape. The door flew open, and bright light hit my eyes. Travante stood on the threshold. His face was smug. "Well, have you thought it over?" he asked with a sneer. "Father, do you feel bad? Should I call a nurse?" He was clearly playing at magnanimity. It was part of his game. "Yes," I said, rising. My voice sounded steady and calm, surprising even myself. "He needs care. Give me the phone. I'll make a call." He was momentarily confused by my submission, but then smirked, handing me his mobile. "Here, 1 call to arrange a nurse, and no funny business." I took the device. Its warmth contrasted with the cold of my fingers. I didn't search for a number in the contact list. I knew it by heart. A few years ago, I had read an article in Essence magazine about a female attorney specializing in complex family cases and inheritance. She was described as a brilliant and uncompromising specialist. I memorized her name just because, just in case. As it turned out, not in vain. I calmly dialed the number. Travante looked down at me, expecting to hear my conversation with some caregiving service. A crisp female voice answered the phone. "Veda Sterling, speaking." "Ms. Sterling, good afternoon," I said, just as evenly and clearly. "My name is Idella Dubois. I urgently need your help." I arranged a meeting with Veda Sterling, and without changing my expression, handed the phone back to my son. He took it with lazy curiosity, scrolling the screen to check who I had called. The number was unfamiliar, without a name. He apparently decided it was a care agency, and complete satisfaction reflected on his face. He had won. The old mother was broken and submitted. "Good girl," he tossed out, more to himself than to me. A sensible decision. "Come on, Kessia, let's help Father up. It's not fitting for him to sit on the steps." They helped Cornelius to his room with that exaggerated, showy care that hurts the eyes with its falseness. They tucked him into bed, adjusted the blanket. Kessia even brought a glass of water. They were acting out a play of magnanimous victors, and I was their main audience. I watched silently, and they mistook my silence for capitulation. That was their first and main mistake. In the following days, a strange, unnatural silence reigned in the house. I performed my duties with mechanical precision, cooking broths for Cornelius, cleaning rooms, doing laundry. I moved through the house like a ghost, a shadow of myself, and this suited them perfectly. They stopped noticing me, the way one notices old furniture. I became part of the interior, convenient and mute, and this gave me what I didn't have before, the opportunity to listen and see. They stopped hiding. They decided they could talk about everything in front of me. After all, a broken spirit is incapable of resistance. One morning at breakfast, while I was silently serving biscuits, Kessia, flipping through some glossy magazine, said to Travante, "Honey, I've been thinking. That wall between the living room and Father's study, it's not load-bearing. If we tear it down, we'll get a huge space, a studio. We can put a white marble bar counter right here." I froze for a moment with the skillet. The wall she wanted to demolish. My father-in-law's desk stood against that wall, where he wrote his last medical journals. Against that wall, Cornelius taught little Travante to write his first letters. There, on the wallpaper, if you looked closely, you could still make out a faint pencil mark. Our son's height at 5 years old. She spoke of it as if it were just an annoying hindrance on the way to a bar counter. "Great idea," Travante responded, not looking up from his coffee. "The study will be free soon anyway, and the library? Well, the books can be sold for scrap or recycled. Who reads them nowadays? Recycled. Books my father-in-law collected all his life. Rare editions on Black history, leather-bound volumes with gold embossing, books signed by the great minds of the Harlem Renaissance. Recycled." I placed the plate of biscuits on the table. My movements were fluid. Not a muscle on my face twitched, but inside me, something cracked and broke off. The last shard of maternal illusion that there was still something left in my son of the boy who listened with delight as his grandfather read aloud to him. They saw my calmness and mistook it for apathy, for senile detachment. They didn't understand that this was the calmness of a surgeon studying the chart of a diseased organ with cold attention before picking up a scalpel. Every word, every gesture was for me a symptom of a disease, their disease, the name of which was greed and vanity. The apotheosis of their delusion came on Tuesday evening. They approached me as I sat by Cornelius's bed, reading old poems to him aloud. They entered with the same serious, concerned faces one wears when visiting the hopelessly ill. "Mom!" Travante began in a tone full of fake sympathy. "Kessia and I have discussed everything. We understand how hard it is for you. All these worries, the house, father. You've laid your whole life down for us. You deserve a rest." Kessia immediately chimed in, placing her manicured hand on my shoulder. The touch was light, but I felt the cold seep under my skin. "We found a wonderful place for you, Ms. Idella, a senior living community, not some nursing home. No, an elite establishment. Just outside Atlanta, pine forest, a pond, 4 meals a day, medical care 24/7. You'll have your own cozy room. You'll be able to walk, read, socialize with people your age. We'll visit you on weekends." They looked at me, expecting gratitude. They sincerely believed they were doing me a favor. They were offering me, the mistress of this house, a cozy room in exchange for my past, my life, everything that was dear to me. They were proposing to tear me from the soil I had rooted into and transplant me into a government-issue pot so I would quietly wither there, not hindering them from building their life on the bones of mine. I raised my eyes to them. I looked at Travante, at his face so like my father's, and at the same time so alien. I searched in him for at least something, a shadow of doubt, a spark of shame, but found none. There was only confidence in his own righteousness and slight annoyance that he had to waste time on these sentiments. At that moment, the last drop of my maternal love died. It didn't evaporate in anger, didn't drown in tears. It simply ceased to be. As if a spring snapped in an old clock and the pendulum, swinging for 40 years, stopped forever. I looked at this man and saw before me not a son, but a stranger, a calculating, cruel stranger with my eyes. And this realization brought not pain, but a strange, cold liberation. I owed him nothing anymore, neither love nor forgiveness nor pity. "That is a very generous offer," I said quietly. My voice sounded hollow but steady. "I need to think." Of course, think about it," Travante rejoiced, clearly pleased the scene had passed without tears or reproaches. "We just want what's best for you." They left, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and absolute confidence in their victory. I remained sitting in the silence, broken only by the breathing of sleeping Cornelius. I looked at our photos on the dresser. Here we were young, at our wedding. Here we were with little Travante on the beach at Tybee Island. A whole life captured in these frames. A life built on love, sacrifice, and, as it turned out now, on lies. But even that lie was nobler than the ugly truth my son and his wife revealed to me today. I no longer felt like a victim. The feeling of resentment evaporated, leaving behind a void and a cold, ringing determination. They themselves erased everything that bound me to them. They freed me from the shackles of maternal duty. They underestimated me. They saw before them a weak old woman. They didn't know that quiet archives store documents capable of changing the course of history, and that a quiet woman who worked with those archives all her life knows how to use them. Tomorrow I have a meeting with Veda Sterling, and I will come to it not with a request for help, but with a ready battle plan. The next day I told Travante I needed to go into town, to the pharmacy for a rare medicine for father that wasn't available at our local one. He gave me money for a taxi with an air of performing an act of the greatest charity. Kessia even helped me put on my coat, straightened my collar, like one does with a child. "Don't be long, Ms. Idella. Lunch needs to be ready." I nodded and left the house, feeling their condescending gazes on my back. They were watching an obedient old woman heading out to run errands. They didn't know I was going to war. Veda Sterling's office was located in a modern building in downtown Savannah with high ceilings and quiet corridors. She herself turned out to be a woman of about 40 with a sharp, piercing gaze and a complete absence of fussiness. She didn't gasp, didn't offer sympathy. She listened. I spoke evenly, without emotion, laying out the facts, the humiliation, the demands, the deed of gift, the basement. When I finished, she was silent for a few seconds, looking at me. "Do you have any documents confirming your rights to the house?" she asked finally. Her voice was calm, but steel could be felt in it. "I have something more important," I answered, and took the tin box from my bag. I laid its contents on the polished table. The birth certificate in the name of Cassius Thorne, the adoption document, my father-in-law's letter. Veda put on her glasses and began to study the papers. She read slowly, attentively, as if absorbing every word. I saw her expression change. Professional interest was replaced by surprise, and then by the concentration of a strategist who has been dealt a winning trump card. She raised her eyes to me. There was no longer simple concern in them. There was excitement. "Mrs. Dubois, this changes everything. Absolutely everything. The Dubois name isn't just a surname. In certain circles, it is capital. Your son built his career, his connections, his entire status on this name. If it turns out he has no blood right to it—" "I understand that," I interrupted her. "I want my house and my peace back." "You will get much more," she said, and notes rang in her voice that stirred me. "You will get justice, but I need time. I need to check some details. The name, Orion Thorne. It vaguely reminds me of something. Let me work with this." I went home, leaving the documents with her, and plunged back into the gray, silent routine. Travante and Kessia, seeing I no longer raised the topic of the nursing home, decided I had resigned myself and was simply awaiting my fate. They already behaved like full owners. Kessia ordered furniture catalogs. In the evenings, they sat in the living room, loudly discussing which shade of gray would best suit the walls in their future studio. I walked past without stopping, but every word they said was deposited in my memory, becoming another stone in the foundation of my resolve. A week passed, a week of sluggish, tense waiting. And then Veda Sterling called me on the old landline when Travante and Kessia weren't home. "Mrs. Dubois, can you talk?" Her voice was tense. Suppressed excitement sounded in it. "Yes, I am alone. I have news. And it is stunning. I pulled the archives. Unofficial ones, of course. I had to use my father's old connections. He was a historian. What I found explains why Langston Dubois was so afraid of his adopted son's past." She paused, and I heard her catch her breath. Orion Thorne wasn't just a political dissident. That's too mild a word. He was one of the leading theoretical physicists of his time, a genius destined for great things. In the late 60s, he was part of a project of national importance, but he had his convictions. He refused to participate in development that, in his opinion, could lead to catastrophe. They tried to convince him, then force him. He didn't yield, and then they broke him. They fabricated a case. He wasn't just accused of dissent. He was accused of treason, of passing secret data to foreign intelligence. I listened, and the cold that had settled in me in the basement seemed to turn into ice, binding my insides. There was a closed trial, Veda continued. His name was erased from everywhere, from scientific publications, from lists of institute employees. It's as if he never existed. But in narrow academic and government circles, his name is still remembered. Not as the name of a scientist, but as the name of a traitor, a brand, a stain that in those circles doesn't wash away even after a generation. I was silent, lacking air. I sank onto a chair. Do you understand what this means, Mrs. Dubois? Veda's voice became quieter but more distinct. Your son, Travante, builds his business on connections. He prides himself on his lineage, his partners, his clients. These are people for whom reputation, purity of name, continuity of generations is everything. They do business with the grandson of the renowned Dr. Dubois. And now imagine what will happen to his business, to his position in society, when it turns out that he is actually the grandson of Orion Thorne, a man whose name for them is synonymous with treason. There it was. That was the weapon I had thought of. But it turned out to be not just a pistol. It was a bomb capable of not just winning back my house, but destroying the entire world my son had so carefully built for himself. This won't just strip him of his inheritance, Veda finished. This will destroy him socially, professionally, financially. He will become an outcast, a pariah. For him and his wife, that is worse than death. I hung up the phone. I sat in the kitchen in silence. The sun shone through the window. A geranium bloomed in a pot on the windowsill. Everything was as always, but the world had changed. The stakes in this game had risen to the heavens. It was no longer about an old house and a humiliated mother. It was about the total destruction of my son's life. And I felt no horror, no pity, no maternal instinct that should have screamed inside me, protecting my child, whatever he might be. No, I felt only cold, eerie satisfaction, a sense of perfect, calculated justice. You wanted to take my house. You wanted to throw me into a home. You wanted to erase my life like an unnecessary entry in a book. Fine, let's see what it's like when your life is erased, when your whole existence, built on pride and lies, turns to dust from a single breath of truth. I stood up and walked to the window. I looked at the garden I had planted with my own hands, at the old pecan tree under which little Travante played. I was saying goodbye to him, not to the man who now lived on the second floor, but to that boy I once loved more than life itself. Saying goodbye forever, because I knew I would pull the trigger without hesitation. I stepped away from the window when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. They were back. My heart didn't flutter. It beat evenly, coldly, measuring out the seconds until the beginning of the end. I went out into the hallway to meet them, not as a servant, but as the mistress of the house. For the first time in months, I squared my shoulders. They entered laughing, laden with bags from expensive stores. Kessia held a roll of wallpaper samples. They were in a great mood. Ms. Idella, you're here, Kessia tossed out, not looking at me. Travante, look, this pearl shade will look perfect in the foyer. They didn't even notice how I had changed. They were too absorbed in themselves, in their future, which they had already planned within the walls of my house. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, the doorbell rang. Travante went to open it, grumbling discontentedly about visits without warning. I waited in the living room. I knew who it was. Veda Sterling stood on the threshold. She was dressed in a sharp, dark suit. In her hands was a thin leather briefcase. Behind her stood an official-looking man, a courier from a legal firm. Dubois Travante Cornelius? Veda asked in an even, businesslike tone. Yes, and who are you? Travante measured her with an appraising look. My name is Veda Sterling. I represent the interests of the owner of this house, Idella Dubois. This is for you. She handed him a thick envelope. Travante took it confusedly. He looked at me, then back at Veda. His face expressed complete bewilderment. "Owner? What owner? This is my family's house." "I would ask you to familiarize yourself with the document," Veda replied coldly. Kessia came out of her room, attracted by the voices. Seeing the strange woman, she frowned. Travante tore open the envelope with irritation. He began to read, and I saw the color slowly drain from his face. First bewilderment was replaced by anger, and then he laughed, loudly, hysterically. "Eviction?" he laughed. "Mama, is this your joke? You hired this actress to scare us? This is just ridiculous." Kessia snatched the paper from him, ran her eyes over it. Her face also twisted into a contemptuous sneer. "Ms. Idella, we thought you had fallen into apathy, but you, it turns out, decided to play drama. Very cute, but we don't have time for this." She turned to Veda. "Miss, I'm afraid my mother-in-law has misled you. She is an elderly person, a bit out of her mind. Here." With a triumphant air, she walked to the credenza, took a folder from a drawer, and pulled a document out of it. "Here is the real document, the deed of gift. The house belongs to my husband, Travante Dubois, so you can use your papers as you see fit." She handed the document to Veda. Veda took it without even glancing at me. She held the paper up to the light, studied it carefully. I saw her calm, focused face. "Interesting document," she said finally, returning it to Kessia. "Especially interesting is Mrs. Dubois' signature, so fresh, and the notary's seal. I know this notary, Mr. Henderson. It is a great pity that he passed away 2 years ago. It must have been a very complex document if he had to notarize it from the other side." A ringing silence hung in the room. The laughter froze on Travante's lips. Kessia looked at Veda. Her face went white as a sheet. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I am talking about the fact that this paper is a clumsy, very clumsy forgery," Veda continued calmly, looking straight into Kessia's eyes. "Forensics will prove this in one day, and then we will be talking not about eviction, but about grand larceny and fraud. That is a felony, several years in prison." Travante stepped forward. His face was crimson with rage. "Who are you to threaten us in our own house?" "I am a lawyer, and I do not threaten. I inform of consequences. The house, as I already said, belongs to my client. This is confirmed by the will of her late father-in-law, Langston Dubois, the original of which I have. It clearly states that the sole heir to all his property is his daughter-in-law, Idella Dubois, in gratitude for her care of the family. Your father, Cornelius, was aware of this and never contested his father's will." She pronounced the word father with a barely perceptible pause. It was the first prick. Travante and Kessia exchanged glances. In their eyes, for the first time, I saw not anger, not contempt, but fear, real animal fear of a beast cornered. They realized this wasn't senile dementia. This wasn't the impulsive act of an offended woman. This was a well-planned attack. "We will contest it," Travante shouted. "We will prove she is incompetent, that you tricked her. I am the only Dubois, the direct heir. I have a right to this house." Veda Sterling nodded slowly, as if she expected exactly these words. She took a step forward. Her voice became quieter, almost confidential, but all the more ominous for it. "You can certainly try. Court proceedings, contesting the will. But keep in mind, Mr. Dubois, to contest Langston Dubois's will, you will first have to prove to the court that you have a legal right to it, that you, as you put it, are a direct heir, and for that—" She paused again, letting every word soak into the air. "It will require a full and public clarification of the Dubois family genealogy, with all necessary genealogical examinations and the unearthing of archival documents to establish, so to speak, the purity of the family line." She fell silent, and in that silence I heard my own heart beating loudly. She didn't say anything directly. She didn't mention the name Thorne. She didn't speak of treason. She just threw that phrase onto the table, full and public clarification of genealogy, and that phrase exploded in the room like a silent bomb. Kessia swayed and grabbed the back of a chair. Her face expressed horror and complete lack of understanding. But Travante understood everything. He didn't know the details. He didn't know the whole truth. But he heard in Veda's words a threat aimed at the very heart of his world, at the foundation of his identity. He paled so much his lips turned blue. They looked at me, at the quiet, gray-haired woman who had stood silently by the fireplace all this time. And in their eyes, I finally saw what I had been waiting for. Not just fear, but realization. Realization that the old woman they had written off, whom they had locked in the basement, whom they were going to ship off to finish her days in a home, held the threads of their fates in her hands, and she was ready to cut them. Veda Sterling nodded to me, turned, and walked out. The courier followed her. The door closed with a quiet click that sounded like a gunshot in the deafening silence. We were left, the three of us, me, my son, and his wife. The air in the room thickened, became heavy. It was hard to inhale. Travante was the first to recover. His initial shock was replaced by rage, dark, animalistic, sweeping away everything in its path. "What was that?" he screamed, turning to me. His face contorted, became alien, vicious. "What have you done? You decided to destroy your own family? You conspired with that shark to throw us onto the street?" He advanced on me, and for a moment I saw in his eyes the same madness as on that day he pushed us into the basement. But there was no fear in me. I stood motionless, looking him in the eyes. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into," Kessia chimed in. Her voice was breaking into a squeal. She paced the room like a bird in a cage. "Genealogy? What genealogy? What did she mean? Have you been hiding something from us? Some shameful secrets?" They screamed, accused, threatened, said they would put me in a mental institution, prove my insanity, that I would disgrace the Dubois' name. They threw words like stones, trying to breach my silence, to force me to be afraid, to retreat. But their stones bounced off my calm confidence like peas off a stone wall. I remained silent and watched. I let their fury burn out, turn to ash. And when the stream of threats ran dry, when they fell silent, breathing heavily, exhausted by their own anger, tactics changed. They saw that I could not be taken by shouting and force, and then they decided to press on other strings, on those which they thought still resonated in my soul. Kessia was the first to sink into a chair and cover her face. Her shoulders shook in soundless sobs. It was an act, I knew, but a skillful one. "Ms. Idella, Mama," she sobbed. "How can this be? We are family. We love you. We wanted what was best. We thought about your future, your peace of mind. Yes, maybe we were wrong, we got heated, but is it worth destroying everything over this?" Travante walked over and squatted in front of me. He tried to take my elbow, but I pulled away slightly, and he removed his hand. He looked up at me. There was no more rage in his eyes. Now feigned grief and filial hurt splashed there. "Mama," he said quietly, soulfully, "remember everything that happened. Remember how you raised me. You gave me everything. You sacrificed your career, your dreams, for me, so that I would become who I am. Can you really destroy all of that yourself now? Were all those sacrifices just to kick me out of my own home in the end?" He spoke of my sacrifices. He who had never appreciated them in his life. He who took them for granted. Now he pulled them out like an old dusty banner, trying to hide behind it. "I am your son, Mama." His voice trembled, and this time it seemed almost sincere. "Fear is a good actor. Your only blood, your continuation. Everything I do for the future of our family, our name, so that the Dubois name sounds even louder. That is your honor, too. Father's honor, grandfather's honor." He spoke, and I looked at him. And for the first time in all this time, I felt something other than cold anger and determination. It was pity. Deep, piercing, almost unbearable pity. Not for my son, but for this man sitting at my feet. for a man whose life turned out to be a house of cards built on the sand of someone else's surname. He clung so desperately to this name, to this myth, because he had nothing else. Without the Dubois name, he was a nobody. He waited for an answer. He waited for tears, reproaches, maybe even forgiveness. He waited for the maternal heart to falter. But it was silent. It had turned to stone that day in the basement. I sighed slowly, and when I spoke, my voice sounded in the silence of the room so calm and distinct that they both flinched. "The house is the least of your problems, Travante." He looked at me uncomprehendingly. "You have lived your whole life," I continued, looking him straight in the eyes, never looking away, "appropriating a legacy that was never yours. The respect you demanded, the name on which you built your life, your business, your pride, all of it is a ghost." I fell silent. I didn't explain anything. I didn't name Thorne. I didn't tell the story of his real grandfather. I just left that phrase hanging in the air between us. A ghost. I saw his brain working, how he frantically tried to understand what I meant. I saw fear begin to take shape in his eyes, the shape of something unknown, but monstrous. "What? What are you saying?" he whispered. "What legacy? What name? I am a Dubois. My father is Cornelius Dubois. My grandfather is Langston Dubois." "Your grandfather Langston Dubois was a great man," I said quietly, "and very noble. He gave your father his name to save him. And you turned that name into a commodity, a shield for your vanity, and you disgraced it. Father was right." I let him figure out the rest himself. I knew my son's imagination. I knew his greatest fears, the fear of being a nobody, the fear of turning out to be an imposter. I saw those fears coming to life in his eyes now, fueled by my silence. He could imagine anything. Illegitimacy, a secret shame in the lineage, any dirt that could stain the shining name of the Dubois family. And any of those guesses was torture for him. I gave him this food for thought, this poison that would slowly poison him from the inside. The horror of the unknown was my strongest ally. Kessia looked from me to her husband, understanding nothing. She only saw that her strong, confident Travante was sitting on the floor, crushed by a few of my phrases. I stood up. I felt very tired, but at the same time surprisingly light. "You were given 3 days to move your things out," I said, heading for the door of my room. "I would advise you not to waste this time on arguments." I entered the room and closed the door behind me. I didn't hear what they said after that. I just went to the bed where Cornelius was sleeping and sat down next to him. I took his hand. It was warm. I looked at his peaceful face and thought about what a heavy burden he had carried all his life, and what a terrible price our son paid, because that burden was never lifted in time. 3 days passed in a thick, tense silence. They didn't move out. I saw them whispering for hours, locked in their bedroom. Their phones didn't stop ringing. I knew they wouldn't give up. They were preparing their last desperate move, and I was ready for it. On the evening of the 3rd day, Travante entered my room. He was dressed in an expensive suit. His face was pale but determined. A kind of feverish, unnatural confidence had appeared in him. "Tomorrow at 11 a.m. at our townhouse," he said in a clipped voice. "Family council. Everyone will be there. Uncle Peter, Aunt Vera, my main business partners. You must be there, and bring your lawyer too. Let's see who wins." He turned and left without waiting for an answer. It was a challenge, their final gambit. They decided to move the battlefield to their territory, surround themselves with allies, and crush me with public opinion. They were going to stage a show trial where I would be the accused, out of my mind. A vengeful old woman who had fallen under the influence of a predatory lawyer. They wanted to declare me incompetent and thus take control of both me and the house. It was a smart move. But they underestimated me again. The next day, precisely at 11 o'clock, Veda Sterling and I entered the living room of their city apartment. It was a huge, faceless space furnished with expensive but cold furniture. And it was full of people. Our relatives were here, whom I hadn't seen for several years. Cornelius's cousin Peter, an important city official, his wife Vera, draped in pearls. There were also people unfamiliar to me with hard business faces, obviously those very partners whose opinion Travante valued so much. Travante and Kessia stood in the center as masters of the situation. Kessia was pouring water into glasses, portraying the gracious hostess. Travante carried himself with that emphasized solidity that was supposed to inspire trust. When we entered, all conversation ceased, all eyes turned to me. I felt their curiosity, judgment, pity. To them, I was the cause of an awkward family drama. Veda and I sat on the offered chairs a little to the side. I was silent. My heart beat evenly. I felt no fear. I felt at home, in my archive, before laying out old documents on the table to restore the truth. Travante began to speak. His voice was full of sorrow and nobility. He spoke of how he loves and respects his mother, how hard it is for him to see her condition. He hinted at clouded reason, at senile touchiness, at how easily elderly people are manipulated. He never called Veda by name once. He spoke only of this woman, an unscrupulous lawyer who wormed her way into the trust of a sick person for profit. He told how he and Kessia took care of father and mother, how they wanted to ensure a quiet, secure old age for them in the best facility. His speech was calibrated. Every word hit the mark. He painted a picture in which he was a loving, suffering son, and I was a deluded, ungrateful mother. He spoke for a long time. Relatives nodded sympathetically. Partners watched with understanding. I saw the scales tipping in his favor. He had almost won. When he finished, a heavy silence hung in the room. Travante looked at me with poorly concealed triumph. "That is essentially everything," he said, spreading his hands. "We only want to protect Mom from herself and from outside influence. We are talking about conservatorship, otherwise she will do foolish things, deprive herself and father of a roof over their heads." Then Veda stood up. She didn't argue or make excuses. She calmly walked to the table in the center of the room. "Everything Mr. Dubois said is very touching," she began in an even voice. "But let's move from emotions to facts. Facts are stubborn things. Mr. Dubois claims he is acting in his mother's interests, fearing she will lose the house. But here's a document." She took a copy of the forged deed from her briefcase and placed it on the table. The document which Mr. Dubois and his wife presented as the basis of their rights to the house. A document according to which Mrs. Dubois has already lost her home. She paused. "And here," she placed another sheet next to it, "is the conclusion of a handwriting analysis confirming the signature is forged, and a certificate from the archives of the notary chamber stating that the notary who allegedly certified this paper died 2 years before it was signed." A murmur ran through the room. Uncle Peter frowned, took off his glasses. Travante's partners exchanged glances. The picture of the loving son began to crack. "These are all insinuations," Travante shouted, but there was no longer confidence in his voice. "These are documents," Veda cut him off. "And now, with your permission, my client will speak. She does not need conservatorship. She needs to be heard." All eyes turned to me again. I slowly rose. I didn't look at Travante. I looked at the faces of the people in this room. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of an archivist accustomed to speaking about facts. My son spoke of the legacy of the Dubois family, of honor. I dedicated my entire life to serving this family and preserving its history. Therefore, allow me to clarify. I took another folder from my bag. Legacy is not just a house and money. It is primarily memory and truth. Here. I placed my father-in-law's letter on the table. This is a letter from my father-in-law, Langston Dubois, to his adopted son, my husband Cornelius. He writes about love, about duty, about nobility. He writes about how he saved an orphan boy by giving him his name. This is the true legacy of the Dubois family, love and self-sacrifice. I spoke calmly, laying out the history of my family before them like solitaire. I told them the truth, not all of it. I didn't name Orion Thorne. I didn't speak of treason. The honor of the family, even one like this, I didn't want to stain publicly. I simply said that Cornelius was an adopted son, the son of a repressed scientist whom Langston Dubois saved from the system, giving him his surname and his love. Langston left this house to me, I pointed to the copy of the will, because he believed I would preserve his spirit, the spirit of a family built not on blood, but on love. And my son, I looked at Travante for the first time, decided that his right to this house was based on a forged paper. I fell silent, and in that silence, everything became obvious. I didn't accuse. I simply juxtaposed two documents. On one side, a letter breathing love and nobility, the real history of the family. On the other, a fake deed, breathing greed and deceit. I contrasted genuine legacy with entitlement. It was the end. I saw it on their faces. Uncle Peter slowly stood up, walked to the table, took my father-in-law's letter, read it. Then he looked at Travante with such contempt that he shrank. The business partners silently rose from their seats and, without saying goodbye, headed for the exit. They wanted nothing to do with a man who not only turned out to be a fraudster, but wasn't a real Dubois. His main capital, his name, turned to dust before their eyes. Kessia stood clutching her husband's arm. Her face was gray with horror. She looked at the departing guests, at the ruins of their world. And I think, at that moment, she hated him. Travante stood in the middle of the room completely alone. He was broken, destroyed, and not by a court, not by the police. He was destroyed by the truth which I, carefully, like an archivist, had brought to light. His final gambit turned into a public execution he had arranged for himself. He was exposed as a cruel, greedy impostor before everyone whose opinion was dearer to him than life. He was completely and finally broken. I turned and, looking at no one else, walked out of the room. Veda followed me. We silently went down to the street where the cool spring air waited for us. It had never seemed so fresh and clean to me. We didn't say a word to each other. Everything had already been said. 6 months have passed. Autumn has come into its own, painting the garden in gold and crimson. The house has become very quiet. This silence no longer depresses me. It was healing, like a cool compress on a wound. It was filled with light penetrating the washed windows, the smell of pecans, and the quiet ticking of the old clock in the living room. Cornelius passed away at the end of summer, quietly, in his sleep, in his bed. His exhausted heart simply stopped. I held his hand until the very end. We didn't talk about Travante. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about our youth, about our first date in Forsyth Park, about how funny he looked trying to fix a leaky faucet. We said goodbye, and when he left, I mourned him. Not the husband bearing someone else's name, but my Cornelius, the only man I loved. I buried him next to his adopted father, Langston Dubois. Two noble men, whose stories turned out to be so closely intertwined, now lay side by side. Travante was not at the funeral. He and Kessia disappeared. They moved out of the city apartment, selling it to pay off debts I hadn't even suspected. Their world, built on the prestige of the Dubois name, collapsed in a single day. Partners turned away. Friends stopped answering calls. The society in which they so wanted to shine expelled them. I heard from distant relatives that they moved to some small provincial town in Alabama, where Kessia found a job as a receptionist in a beauty salon. Nothing was heard of Travante. He didn't call, didn't write. For me, he simply ceased to exist, like the ghost I once spoke of. I felt neither gloating nor hatred, only emptiness in the place where maternal love used to be. Today I went down to the basement, but it was no longer the dark, damp crypt where my rebirth once began. I hired workers. They cleaned it out, whitewashed the walls, installed bright lighting. Along the walls now stood not dusty shelves with jars, but new pine ones, smelling of resin. In the center, a large, sturdy work table, my table. This basement, once my prison, became my sanctuary, my personal archive, the place where I finally returned to myself. I slowly laid out old photographs, letters, documents on the table. All my life, I had been the keeper of other people's stories, the history of the Dubois family, the history of my husband, the history of my son. I carefully collected them, cataloged them, protected them. Now the time has come to collect my own. I took a new album with blank pages in a hard leather binding. On the first page, I neatly placed Langston Dubois's letter, a document about love and nobility that became the cornerstone of this story. Next to it, I placed a photograph, not my wedding one, not a photo with my son, but another, small, black and white one taken many years ago. In it, a young girl with glasses and short hair sits at a desk piled with old tomes, looking into the lens with delight. That was me, Idella, a 20-year-old history student at Spelman College, in love with her profession, full of hopes and plans. The me I had buried myself under the rubble of family obligations and sacrifices. I looked at this girl and smiled. I had been walking back to her for so long, through 40 years of serving others, through betrayal and pain, through the cold of the basement. I finally found her. I was no longer just a keeper. I became an author, the author of my own story, in which I myself decided what was important and what needed to be left in the past. I didn't cross anything out of it. Neither the joy of motherhood nor the bitterness of disappointment. But now I placed the accents myself. I gave events the meaning I considered true. I finished my work and walked to the small high window of the basement, which the workers had cut through at my request. It looked straight out into the garden. From down here, the world looked different. I saw not the trunks of trees, but their roots going deep into the earth. I saw fallen leaves that would become soil for new life in the spring. I placed a cup of hot tea on the windowsill. The aroma of Earl Grey mixed with the smell of earth and wilting foliage. Steam from the cup rose to the glass, and the world outside the window became a little blurry, like an old watercolor. I took a sip. It was quiet in the house, quiet in my soul. For the first time in many, many years, I didn't feel like someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's daughter-in-law. I was simply Idella, a woman looking out the window of her house at her garden. A woman no longer defined by her past sacrifices, but defined by that calm, conscious future she built for herself. I was free, absolutely, completely, until my very last breath. Free. That is where my story comes to an end. Thank you for spending this time with me. If it resonated with your soul, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your feedback is the greatest support for me. I wish you peace in your heart and warmth in your soul. Until we meet again. Such a complicated but very deep story, dear listeners. A story about sacrifice, betrayal, and that terrible price one sometimes has to pay for one's own freedom and dignity. It makes you think about a lot, doesn't it? The main question left hanging in the air is the question of boundaries. Where is that line beyond which a mother's all-forgiveness ends and the fight for one's own life begins? Did Idella act correctly by destroying her own son's world, even in response to his monstrous cruelty? Was it an act of just retribution or cold, calculated revenge? Each of you, I am sure, has formed your own opinion. Perhaps someone will condemn Idella for her ruthlessness, and someone, on the contrary, will admire her strength and determination. Perhaps you still have questions about the fate of the characters, or some detail of the story sparked particular curiosity. Share your thoughts in the comments below this video. I am always incredibly interested to read your reasoning and see how differently the same story resonates in people's hearts. Your opinion is very important to us. If this story touched you, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Every like, every new subscriber is a huge support for us and an incentive to continue looking for and voicing new, no less exciting stories for you. It is important for us to know that our work finds a response. Did you like the story, and which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.